Jonathan Schick back with you with another episode of Shtisel Man, and this week we have season 3, episode 6, and a very poignant, touching episode on so many levels, and a very humorous one. This is probably one of my favorite episodes, might be one of your favorites too. Obviously, the comic effect of Tzvi Aryeh, getting locked in the car is what might first come to mind when you think about this episode. But for me, the incredible dual storylines of Shulem's loneliness and Racheli and Akiva's dance trying to find each other were just incredible. Let's start with Shulem. I can't think of a more, and there's a lot of poignant scenes and a lot of pathos, as we've talked about in Shtisel Man. There are few scenes, and this is not contrived either. It's so well done that it's so natural. That Shulem is sitting on the porch dialing the number of Mrs. Chemdat, the woman who, when he called the Kupat Cholim, the medical service, so to speak, in Israel, he reached as this woman who's also a widow. And by the way, this can happen in Israel. It can't really happen in America. It can happen in America or other parts of the world, but it's much more likely to happen in a place like Israel, where there's one big family aspect in a way. And for a woman to start sharing her woes to a complete stranger on the phone is not out of the realm of possibility. It's interesting. This one's actually happened to me. I was actually on the phone with this customer service agent years ago, probably a few years ago, and it was booking a ticket. I was having trouble booking a ticket and back and forth. And I was on the phone with this woman for about, an hour, a good hour. By the end of the call, she actually started talking about herself and her personal life. So that, so this really can happen. And it's, but Sholem goes ahead, and here he is after this woman, sort of bears her soul to Shulem on the phone. He starts calling the Kupat Cholim to try to reach her again. And sitting out there on the porch and just the pangs of loneliness, his heart actually aching from the loneliness. And loneliness is, in fact, can lead to things like heart disease and whatnot, as was described in this episode. It's actually a very interesting episode in its relation between the body and the soul and the mental part of ourselves and the physical, because we're going to see that with Racheli and Akiva in a minute. But just to finish off with Shulem, this aspect, these pangs of loneliness and this sort of misery that sets into him really leads him to a really desperate mindset, which we will see what that might lead to as we continue on in this series. But it's a desperation point for Shulem. It's really a place where he feels that he's out of options. He doesn't have options for love. He doesn't have options for with family as much. And it's just sort of leaving him in a very, very tough space. Let's turn our attention now to Racheli and Akiva. And Racheli admits, she starts out with an episode of mania, really, because she goes and buys tickets for 50,000 shekels, which is probably around, $15,000. Sounds pretty expensive. Maybe they were first class, but she goes ahead and buys these tickets for her and for Akiva, and she's already dreaming of a long future with her new, instant husband, Akiva. And so she goes ahead and she does this in an episode of mania, and then she has a down episode of depression, and this leads her to sort of reveal to Akiva of the mental illness that she has. And this is also very poignant because we see that, first of all, kudos to the series for taking on mental illness. Even though in most locations, in most societies today, in the Western world, if you will, there's understanding and there's acknowledgement of how mental illness can be just as devastating and debilitating as physical illness. And it's not something that people make a choice about, whether they're going to be depressed today or not. So kudos to the writers for writing this piece in. But beyond that, it also shows the connection between the heart and the soul and the body, if you will, that goes on in Shtisel, in the sense that there's so much beyond just the physical attraction and, back and forth. This is a highly, highly emotionally sensitive series. And that's what makes Shtisel so universal. The same way, in fact, that Seinfeld, due to its comic genius, despite the fact that it has so many Jewish sort of like innuendos, and same thing with Curb Your Enthusiasm with Larry David maybe to a lesser degree, because it's quite vulgar, but at least Seinfeld captures something in a national and international audience because it transcends the humor transcends the particularistic nature of that religion or that culture. Same thing with Shtisel. Shtisel resonates so well because it goes beyond the Jewish story, even though by doing so, it actually accentuates the beauty in a lot of ways of the Jewish lifestyle. But it's way beyond that. It's a highly, highly emotionally sensitive series. So we have Racheli and Akiva, and I find Racheli and Akiva to be really matched extremely well. Out of all the women that Akiva went with, Elisheva could have been, Libby, we didn't really get to know her well enough and to see their marriage, to see how that would go. But with Racheli, I find the vulnerability in Racheli combined with Akiva's, sensitivity, a really compelling match. And so they go back and forth, and this particular episode ends up with, finally, Racheli gives back the painting of the late wife back to Akiva. Akiva has to realize, the same way that Shulem has to realize, you have to give up the ghost in order to move forward, and again, Shulem does reference his late wife as well in this series. So we see a tandem approach that the writers geniusly put in here. Again, Akiva not letting go his wife, and Shulem not letting go his wife. And although the strings are finally beginning to be cut, and Shulem is really, I think, facing the reality that his life is extremely colorless without the benefit of a companion and a loved one. And Akiva too, finally, with all these games of Akiva, as we say, being in love with love, but not necessarily being in love with another, finally may come to a close. We will see in the last few episodes if he and Racheli are finally able to bond and come together, and if Akiva is able to leave that painting behind. We'll be back with more Shtisel Man coming up soon. And again, this is recorded on the last day of Hanukkah, and we wish you the end of Hanukkah to be a happy one. Don't forget to subscribe, and all the best.